This is definitely a common myth, and it's a perception which in part is sometimes, I think, supported and generated by some of the media coverage. And I think one of the reasons for this is perhaps it's easier to have a visual impression, the concept of traffic victims being in chains, locked up, kept away. It sort of supports the idea of sort of slave-like situations, which is what we often come to perceive as trafficking meaning.
So it is assumed, because of the mainstream media, which often are interested in mainly selling stories, that victims of sexual exploitation are really kept in cages and locked up in rooms and, you know, physically tied up and things like this. And unfortunately, these kinds of sensationalist stories, not that it doesn't happen, but it's not the common story. But because of these kind of mainstream media stories, this is what people believe.
There are, of course, many victims who feel stuck in a coercive environment. But more often than not, people are trapped by circumstance. And often the circumstances are orchestrated by the trafficker.
You may not be physically trapped somewhere to warrant being regarded as being trafficked or being a slave or in slave-like conditions. You have to look at the factors.
They are not really physically trapped, but more like mentally trapped. I think that the chains are less visible.
Certainly when you're speaking to these individuals, how did you get here? Did you have papers before? Who gave them to you? Where are they now? Who took them from you? What were you told before? What's the situation now? How is that different? And can you do anything about it? You know, are you able to access help? Are you able to leave?
They may be trapped by a debt relationship, for example. We see many cases where people have incurred, for whatever reason, a debt with the trafficker and feel compelled for various reasons to pay that debt off. They're often given very little choice as to how they pay that debt off. A particular option, an employment option, is offered, and that is the only way. And then what tends to happen is, of course, the debt never gets paid off. The debt is really a device to encourage somebody to think that if they just work hard, the debt will be paid. But the debt is always increasing.
A traffic victim who has been moved into a situation of exploitation, very often they may have had their ID documents or their passports confiscated. They may be in fear of reprisals against family members back home if they don't do what the trafficker tells them to do. So I think in reality it is more this psychological and emotional pressure and fear that is put onto the traffic victims, which keeps them trapped in those situations.
There are circumstances that we found from the victims these days are more like their passports are taken away, they are watched closely, and they have no chance to escape.
So a coercive environment is usually the more common means by which somebody is controlled and exploited, rather than a physical environment. Having said that, it is true that some victims are controlled physically as well.
In a way, the traffickers make them feel that they have some sort of freedom. Sometimes the trafficker gives their mobile phone to the victims or take them to the salon or allow them to go shopping, but there will always be someone watching over them all the time.
What really needs to be understood is that trafficking for sexual exploitation is a form of abuse, like many other forms of abuse that use psychological control. Psychological control in terms of making people feel very low self-worth, dehumanizing them, and even when victims of sexual exploitation are physically abused and sexually abused, the main method of control is still psychological. So